The following program is brought to you by coronavirus and the newest in the beta coronavirus line, COVID-19. Coronavirus, bringing human misery for 8,000 years. And by the state of Wisconsin's prohibition on gatherings of more than 10 people. Wisconsin, forward. And by the faculty and staff of Lawrence University.
Hi, welcome back to Historic Preservation. We're in Lecture 5 now, which is basically about what makes a property historic, what makes it worth preserving, and the answer to that is significance. So we're going to talk about significance today. So, what is significance? First of all, what it means is that a property, a site, a landscape, whatever it is historical or culturally important. It has some level of historical or cultural importance. Okay, that's pretty vague. But in fact, these criteria are all pretty vague and are all open to interpretation. Okay, historical importance, cultural importance means that something unique happened there. Something happened in that place that it was a singular event that had an impact on American culture, United States history, things like that. Or that the place was or is an image of, a picture of, it encapsulates somehow something of great meaning to American culture, or some historic period of time or series of events of importance, like the Civil War, for example. That's one part of significance. The other part is that a place might have great architectural value. It's a unique example of an architectural style, of a particular architect, of a period of time. So these are the two basic criteria of significance. They are really vague, right? Really vague. And so what we have to look at is some more specific criteria that help us to determine whether, in fact, something is historically or culturally important, or something has architectural value. So, what we look at are 4 criteria that have been put in place as part of the National Register of Historic Places application process. And we'll go into that application process in some more detail later and in the next lecture. The 4 criteria are lettered, so A, B, C, D. The first criteria is one that is most likely to be used for what we're doing, because we are not architects, but are historic preservationists, not historical architects. And this criteria basically says that a property or place is associated with the events that have made a significant contribution to broad patterns of American history. Okay. Let's think about some things that might make a significant contribution to broad patterns of American history. So, if we have a local church that was founded by a group of prominent citizens in a community, and it's the first church in that community, well, those are important events, but did they make a significant contribution to broad patterns of American history? Church founding in towns is a broad pattern. The leaders in a community would do that as a broad pattern. Is that a significant contribution to American history? Probably not. unless this is a really major church, like, I don't know, the first church in Boston or the first church in the country or something like that. But probably not. Again, this is open to debate and conjecture. And what happens in the nomination process is that one has to make an argument that it does meet this criteria. And you might be able to do that with a local church. But if you have something affiliated with a major battle in the Civil War, a house that stood next to the battlefield in a major battle in the Civil War, that's going to be part of a significant contribution to broad patterns of American history. The Civil War is an important place. If you have a house that somehow was the focus of meetings where civil rights advocates planned demonstrations or something, that's a broad pattern of American history, significant contribution, you can make a good argument for that. So that's what criteria A means. Criteria B is that the property is associated with the life of a significant person in the American past. Okay, let's go back to the church example. This is the church where Martin Luther King preached. Okay, that's pretty important. This is the church where a prominent figure in a local community who founded the first church in that community preached. No, is that really a significant person in the American past? Again, if it's the first church in Boston, if it's Cotton Mather or someone like that, well, maybe. You have to make that argument, though. Things that are affiliated with certain people, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, pretty much fit into this almost automatically. All the people on Mount Rushmore are going to fit into this. But lesser figures, James Monroe, maybe. The house he lived in after he was president, that might fit. Place where the Appomattox end of the Civil War was signed, that's going to be, that's a significant event, sorry. But the house where that person, I forget his name, lived at the start of the Civil War, it's a significant person. So those are criteria B. Criteria C is that the property embodies distinctive features that represent the work of a master. Okay, this is more architectural. This is something that we probably, as historic preservation people, rather than historic architects, aren't going to get into that much, but the book talks about Frank Lloyd Wright. Here there's an architect in Appleton named William Waters. He's considered a master, and some of his houses are on the National Register because of him. He designed some of the pavilions at the Chicago World's Fair. He designed a bunch of important buildings in Milwaukee. So he's considered a master. So that's one of the things. If you have a great architect, that could meet criteria C. Possesses a high artistic value. Houses that are quite unique. The Winchester House, if you know what that is this weird, unique place. There are other buildings that are strange, unique, interesting places, or places that a master built that are really unique parts of that master's work. For example, Falling Waters House here in Wisconsin, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. It's not here in Wisconsin, but I think it's in Pennsylvania or New York, I don't remember. But that has a high artistic value. Or places that represent a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. What does that mean? Okay. That means that a structure is an embodiment or a classic example of a particular style of architect. That any of the given pieces of that structure might not be that important, but together it represents a great example of a particular style of architecture, a particular time period, things like that. So we're going to be looking at the Greenough Mansion. One of the things that distinguishes it is that it is a great example of Greek Revival architecture. Nothing particularly in that house is of great distinction, but has great architecture. Here on campus, International House has carving that is of great distinction, and that carving, it is also by a master carver, though I don't remember his name, and that house was designed by William Waters, who's considered a master. Those criteria fit into that, and that actually is a National Register eligible house. It's on the National Register because it's in a National Register district, City Park Historic District, but it would be individually eligible because of those two criteria. All right, and finally, criteria D. This is primarily what archaeological sites fall into. This is a place that is likely, that it yields or is likely to yield important information in history or prehistory. This really is not buildings as much as sites, and clearly this fits for an archaeological site, battlefield, a place that has never been touched, is an original prairie ground, might be something like this. So these are what archaeological sites often fall into. Okay, let's take a little break. We'll come back. Please give your attention to this important public safety announcement.
Hi, it's Dr. Pudelheimer here. As you can see, I am in my bedroom because I am in self-isolation. I am not feeling too well. So I called my doctor, but he said to self-isolate. What does this mean? This means I stay in my room. And I try not to talk or see or touch anything because I don't want my family to get sick. So, if you have to self-isolate, make sure that you do and do a good job of it. Okay? Auf Wiedersehen! Tschüss! Bye-bye!
Okay, we are back. We just talked about the criteria for eligibility on the National Register. There's one other element, in addition to matching those criteria, that has to be taken into account. The structure or place has to not only meet the criteria of the National Register, but it has to show integrity. In other words, it has to have those criteria. It's a place where a significant event occurred. It's a place associated with a significant person, those kinds of things. But it also has to maintain integrity, which is the following. How well does it represent those criteria? So let's say that it is where an important event that represents broad patterns of American history occurred. Well, if it's a minor location, and we could talk about that church. Church here in town, founded by the first members of the town, founded as the first church in the town. Does that really represent the criteria of an important place that represents a broad pattern of American history? Or is affiliated with important people? Probably not. But downstate, a place called the Hoggy Log Church was the first Lutheran church in Wisconsin, the first Lutheran church in the Wisconsin territories. Lutheranism is really important in the upper Midwest. First Lutheran church in the Wisconsin territories. Yeah, that represents a broad pattern of American history. So that's the question. How well does it actually represent that criteria? And then, more importantly, how well is its original context preserved? If you've got the Hoggy Loggy Church, and it's now in the middle of a city, maybe, maybe not. That particular place is where it was, and it's in the environment that it was in. There's nothing around it. So it represents the original context really well. If there's a church here in town that has a high-rise building next to it, or has had a modern hall attached to it or something, the original context may not be preserved that well. The book talks about the Alamo, which, if any of you have been there, is really in the middle of a city. But a large area around the Alamo is walled in, and once you go in there, as the book talks about, it's really different. It does take you back to the original context. So, integrity, two really important criteria here. And there are a set of very specific criteria to look at to evaluate integrity. And although not all of these have to be met, it's important that most of them are met. So here they are. The location. Is the location still have the historic context, still maintain the integrity of when the historic event occurred, when the historic person was there, when the broad patterns of history occurred, all of those things. The design. Is the design still the same, or has it been modified a lot? The setting is kind of like the location. Is it still in its natural setting? Is it still the way it was when the event occurred, when the person was there? Is it in a setting where it's going to yield historic information? Are the materials the same, or has it been sided with aluminum or something? Or has the windows, the roof, whatever, all been changed? Is the workmanship the same, or has it been altered? Has the woodwork been taken off and new vinyl trim put on, something like that? Okay, and then there's two really weird ones. Is the feeling the same? Does the feeling have integrity? That, by definition, is really hard to evaluate. But I'll give you two examples. One of them is Casa Grandes in Tucson, Arizona. Casa Grandes was, as you read in the book, one of the first national historic landmarks or historic monuments. It's a National Register site. It's in the middle of a city, and there's been a lot of pressure to build around it. There has recently been arguments about, in one case I believe it was a Hardee's that was going to be built next to it, in another case I believe it was a Walmart. Either of those would have disturbed the setting and the feeling of being at that site. And so they were prevented. There's a lot of this with battlefields. Battlefields, especially Civil War battlefields, are now in the middle of development a lot of times. Some of them in the West are not. But in the East, Manassas, for example, is surrounded by urban places. In order to maintain the setting, the feeling of that place, there has been a limit on what can be built around it so that you can maintain what are called view sheds, so that you can see the battlefield without seeing a McDonald's sign or something in the background. If you've got a historic battlefield that now doesn't have the same kind of setting or feeling, like you're going back in time, that might hurt the integrity. And finally, the association. That again is a little bit weird. Is it really, to what extent is it really associated with the broad patterns, with the people, with the original context that this place was in. To some extent, that's location, but it's really all of that together, the location and the design and the setting and all of that. How much is this really associated? How much does it really bring you back to the time or the person? How much does this really offer in terms of information? It's kind of a final overall look at some of these things. Now, having said all that, the integrity criteria don't all have to be met. The criteria for being included don't all have to be met. One of those criteria for being included have to be met. And most of these should be met. But there's kind of a sliding scale, and the book talks about it as a thermometer. I just think of it as kind of a sliding scale, that most of these should be met. A couple of them maybe not, but they should generally be met. In addition to that, there is, there we go, what's called the 50-year rule. Something has to be 50 years old before it can be listed. Book talks about some reasons why that might not be such a good idea. I disagree with that. You can wait 50 years. It isn't that long of a time. So something has to be older than 50 years to be listed. And that, in a sense, just helps to establish that, yeah, this really is important. This isn't something that seems important right now and seems really important, but in another 50 years it's going to be like, yeah, that was nothing. It has to be more than 50 years old. And this is another weird concept. The historical context has to be well established. In other words, even though it may meet one of the 4 criteria, and even though it may meet all of these, if the historical context is not really established, then you've got a problem. You have to be able to demonstrate very clearly that it fits into one of the criteria and that it fits most of these. If your data context is anecdotal or not clear, or the historical context can't be really argued as that important, that historical context has to be there, or the property of the site isn't going to be registered. There are a number of criteria that exclude properties from being listed on the National Register. The first of these are religious properties. It's basically churches, synagogues, mosques, atheistic places of meeting. Religious properties are excluded primarily because of the Establishment Clause of the Constitution that government will not establish a religion. All right. If churches could be listed normally, that might be seen as the government putting a particular status on a church or on a given religion. And that's unconstitutional. So religious properties are automatically excluded in terms of being religious properties. However, if a church is the location of an important historical event, like the church of Martin Luther King that was bombed in Selma, Alabama, that could be listed for that event, not as a religious property. A church where a very important preacher or figure gave a lecture, or it was their church where they preached, Cotton Mather's Church, for example, that could be listed because of the event, this important speech, or because of the very important person who preached there, who was the minister for that church. A church might also be listed architecturally because it is a unique architectural property. But none of those have anything to do with its religious nature. And that's the key part. Here in town, my church, First English Lutheran Church, which is on City Park, is on the National Register. But it's on the National Register because it's part of the City Park Historic District, not because it's a church. It could also be listed, and one of the pieces that is important about it is that it has unique stone architecture. It could potentially be listed because of that unique stone architecture, but it is not listed because it is a church. Now, down in Mineral Point, there's a church called the Hoggy Log Church, where the Lawrence Archaeological Survey has done some work. That actually is listed as a religious property, but it is the first Lutheran church in Wisconsin. Now that has some broad historical significance. The Upper Midwest is a Lutheran area, and Lutheranism has a lot of important historical contexts here in Northeast, or here in the Upper Great Lakes. This was the first church in the Wisconsin Territory in Wisconsin, and that really makes it of broad historical significance. It also maintains all of the other things. It has its location, it has the setting is there, the feel of the church because it's the original church. All of that integrity parts are there, and therefore, even though it is a religious property, that is listed on the National Register. Properties that have been moved are essentially automatically excluded, and the reason for that is that the setting is totally changed. So the integrity of that particular property has been damaged. Location, the setting, all of those things have been totally transformed. And so properties that have been moved are generally not on the register, except if they were moved and then an important event happened there. So you can kind of see how those are all kind of judgment calls. But in general, properties that have been moved aren't eligible. And here on campus, what used to be called Sabin House and now is the Center for Religious, whatever it is, the religious center, Center for Religious Life. That used to be on the other side of the quad, and it was moved 180 degrees. That technically would not be eligible for listing. It is part of the City Park Historic District, so in that sense, it's National Register eligible, but it has been moved. Okay. Birthplaces and graves are generally not eligible. The birthplace of a really important person, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, might be eligible because that is associated intimately with an important figure. But it has to be a figure of that status. Graves, in the same way, are generally not listed unless they're for a person of outstanding status. Lincoln, Washington, Grant, those kinds of people, their graves are listed. Cemeteries are not generally eligible for being listed for a number of reasons. One of them is that there's a lot of other laws that cover cemeteries as historic properties and human remains. More importantly, though, the context of cemeteries is generally very mixed. One of the reasons you might list a cemetery is because an important person's grave is there, but the entire cemetery, it doesn't need to be listed. You might list that grave, and even there, it would have to be a really unique person, and those unique people have their own tombs. If a cemetery is a place where a battle occurred, for example, or is the place where a very important speech in American history was given, the Gettysburg Address, for example, dedicating a cemetery for the soldiers at Gettysburg, that could be listed. But in general, cemeteries are not listed just because there's important people in them, or because they're a unique historic place. Those are included. And also a lot of cemeteries are still active, and so they're continuously changing and not 50 years old in that way. Reconstructions are generally not eligible for listing because they don't have the integrity. They're not the original structure. They don't have the original workmanship. They don't have the original, well, they might have the original setting, but they're not the original structure. Having said that, right across the river from here, at the end of the Law Street Bridge, there is a reconstruction that is listed on the National Register. Okay, why? The reason is that the material inside of it, let me go back. This was the first hydroelectric switching station in the world. The switching station components, the dynamo, the Edison Dynamo Model 2, the switching apparatus, the hydroelectric propeller, all of that stuff, the original equipment is all in that structure. The structure itself began life in one place and was moved to another place and then became degraded, run down, and so it was reconstructed. It also is a national engineering landmark because it was the first hydroelectric switching station. And actually, it powered lights for structures here on campus, including International House, the house next to it, a house called Hulbert House that's now gone, and a house that sat where the Memorial Union is. Those 4 houses were lit from that switching station. It was moved back, or it was put back essentially as it was through this reconstruction after it had been moved and the building degraded. And because the context is so important, the physical plant essentially is still there, all the original equipment. The reconstruction was done more than 50 years ago in order to bring this essentially back sort of as it was. And because it's already a landmark, it was, even though it's a reconstruction, included on the National Register. And finally, commemorative monuments are generally not eligible. And the reason for that sort of goes to the religious idea. If you put a particular commemorative monument on the National Register, it could be taken as giving special status to a given event or a given group of soldiers or a given whatever happening in a community or somewhere else. And then other communities and other groups might say, but what about our commemorative monument? Why is that one special and this one not? You get into all kinds of problems. The commemorative monuments also commemorate something. They aren't the place where it actually took place, and that's what the National Register wants to list. Now again, if a monument was the place of an important speech or a very important event, like the Lincoln Memorial, is where Martin Luther King gave his great speech. If that had been given at a minor memorial in Alabama somewhere, that memorial might be listed because of that important event. But as a monument, it's not going to be listed. If it's really of unique architecture or was designed by a master, it might be listed. But just commemorating an event is not enough. Okay, let's take a short break. We'll be back. And now, gratuitous sex.
You know, there's something awfully big about you.
Thank you, dear. Thank you, dear. Thank you.
Your nose.
Something awfully big about you, too.
And we are back. Now we're going to go through the nomination process. It's a fairly simple process, but it takes a lot of work. The first thing is the application. The application is a long and detailed application. It consists largely of 3 parts. First, There's the basic information on the location of the property, who owns it, what it is, how many buildings are there, how many are original, what it's being used for now, all that kind of stuff. That's fairly easy to get. The big part has to do with two descriptions. One of them is the narrative description. This puts forward the history of the property, and it has to be done in great detail. When was it built? What happened to it? What happened that would make it National Register eligible? What happened after that? The entire narrative history of the building. If it's associated with an important person, the history of the person. If it's associated with an important event, that. If it's an architectural nomination, all about the architecture. Very detailed narrative description. And then a statement of significance, which then takes the material in the narrative and explains how it fits one of the four criteria, or one or more of the four criteria. As part of both the narrative and the statement of significance, integrity has to be addressed, and historical context has to be addressed. So these two are actually a very difficult and time-consuming process to create that application. Once the application is done, it is submitted to the local CLG if the local Historic Preservation Commission is a CLG. The CLG will evaluate it, normally go back and forth between the person doing the application or the group doing the application, doing edits and asking for more information, clarification, stronger argument, issues about integrity, all that kind of stuff. Once that's done, it's forwarded to the SHPO. Now, if there isn't a local CLG, that process happens with the SHPO. And that's a much more difficult process because the SHPO and the SHPO's office are very busy with other things, and so this ongoing back and forth about the narrative, the statement of significance, issues of integrity, historical context, all of that stuff is much more difficult to do, and that's one of the reasons why CLGs are important in the historic preservation process. Once the SHPO finds the application acceptable, if the SHPO does, then there is a comment period where the public in the state or in the local community can comment on the nomination. And this is where people can object because whatever reason. It's where people can offer support. If nothing destroys the application because of the comments, it then is forwarded to a person called the Keeper of the National Register. This is a person that's part of the Advisory Council and essentially maintains a National Register. That person then evaluates the application, and typically if the SHPO has approved it, it goes through. If there's real serious issues having to do with the criteria and their application, or one of the issues of exclusion, or one of the issues of integrity, it could be rejected. But in general, it is not. That then has a comment period, a national comment period. Some of the same comments come up again, all that stuff. And if at the end of the comment period there are no major issues, then it's approved by the keeper and published in the Federal Register. Ultimately published in the Code of Federal Regulations, but published in the Federal Register, and then it's on the list. One of the interesting things is that there isn't an entirely complete list of the National Register anywhere. You technically would have to go through all of the Federal Register publications. And I think earlier I said I didn't know how often it was published. It's published daily. Actually, the Federal Register is published daily and then bound once a year into formal Code of Federal Regulations for that year. National Park Service does maintain the National Register, and The properties are actually all listed there, but the information about them is not there in all cases. They're trying to get a comprehensive list of all the applications and information and all the Federal Register material and the comments and all that stuff. It's not there yet, but it will be. Okay. There are a series of other forms of designation that historic properties can have. One of those I've already talked at length about. Those are historic districts, and Lawrence University sits in an historic district, the City Park Historic District. A historic district is typically nominated by the local Historic Preservation Commission, or CLG, and it identifies an area that has historic significance, represents a unique time capsule of a town, contains a group of maybe individually not significant structures, but together represent a unique period in time, a unique picture of the architecture of the region, or things like that. That's what the City Park Historic District and Lawrence University, as part of that, all do. There are also historic landmarks. These are nominated by the Secretary of the Interior, and they mark really important locations. They are on the National Register, but they're above it, kind of. These are really of national importance. So those are kind of different than the National Register. They're more significant, and they come right from the Secretary of the Interior. There are also historic landscapes of a variety of types. Some of those are actual landscapes. They're natural areas. But most of them are designed landscapes. And there are places like Central Park or Grant Park in Chicago that have been designed. There are formal gardens that have been designed. There are regions that have been farmed and transformed by humans that now are landscapes that are unique. And so those, kind of like a historic district, they're an accumulation, a group of unique places that together form a unique picture of a time period or a historical event or something like that. And then finally, this is relatively new, but there are heritage areas, and there's a wide group of different heritage area projects that have happened over the years. The Fox River has been trying to become a heritage area because of the locks, and there are other places described in the book where systems of locks have become heritage areas. Highway 66 itself is kind of a long heritage area. There are other heritage areas or heritage parkways and things like that. So these are other forms of designation. Okay, that's it for this lecture. We'll see you next time. Oh, hello. You might notice I've moved to my cabin. Some people call it a castle. I call it a cabin. And I'm reading in your textbook, this one. There's an interesting quote by David Hammer on page 140. It goes like this. He writes, "The concept of the historic district has, to a large extent, been based on a commitment to a representation of history as static, as a series of points in time, artificially frozen and then immunized to a substantial degree from the impacts of change. This is not only or even anti-historical, it is also profoundly anti-urban in the sense that it denies the diversity that is the very essence of urban life and the source of its greatest challenges and enjoyment. For change is the essential and only constant characteristic of the history of many American city districts." That's very similar to many of the things we've been talking about in class, that history is something that changes and that buildings are essentially living places, that they're entities that evolve and change over time. take a little time to think about this contrast between history seeming like a static past and buildings seeming like a static entity. And the idea that history is a flow, that it's dynamic, that it's always moving, and so buildings and spaces are always dynamic, moving, evolving. I think that will be an interesting thought exercise.